Hi and welcome to Event Handling Fundamentals, where you'll learn everything you need to know to handle events from JavaScript. Historically, there are a few APIs or a few approaches to handle events from JavaScript, and not all of them stood the test of time. So I'm using this opportunity to show you what you can actually use and what you shouldn't. The oldest event API is to use an element property like on and then the name of the event. On click, for instance, for a mouse click event. There are other events, you'll see them during the course of this module and also in future modules. And you could also use an HTML attribute of the same name, on click. This comes from Netscape. The team at Netscape invented the JavaScript language, so they had to make up something to make event handling work. And that's what they chose. Let's have a look. I have created a very simple function, add to cart, which basically increases the number next to the shopping cart in the header of the page by 1. And I like to call this whenever the add to cart button is clicked. There are two ways how I can do this using the Netscape inspired API. So either I could go to the button and then just add on click equals, and now the content, the value of this HTML attribute needs to be valid JavaScript code. So add to cart and then parentheses, and that's it. So that would be one option. The other option would be that I'm setting the on-click property. So how about we start by selecting the first button. So let our button be document query selector, and I'm just looking for a button element. I have 5 button elements on the page, at least currently. A query selector only returns the first one. So I will be using that. And then I could use that button and set its on-click property to add to cart. And this time I'm setting a property, so I cannot run code here or should not run code here. Instead, I just reference or point to that function. So that would work as well. Let's try this out in the browser. I hit the add to cart button, and every time I do, the code runs and I increase the number of tickets in my shopping cart. I could also use an anonymous function, so something like this. And then in that function I run some code. So this is now, of course, some extra typing and doesn't have much benefit here. But in practice, pretty often, if there's just some throwaway code that you need exactly once, it often is put in an anonymous function like this and not put into a separate function. There are other options as well. One method is called attach event, also as a method of an element you have previously selected, for instance, by using document get element by ID. And that's what the Internet Explorer team came up with. They also supported the Netscape API, but they were looking for something different, maybe something better. Well, they were the only ones who believed in the superiorness of their approach, so no other browser adapted that, and eventually Internet Explorer chose to follow what the W3C suggested. A method called add event listener. So that's the only thing that's really standardized. Standardized in the DOM specification. It's not a JavaScript feature. But add event listener is usually the recommended way to go, although you can come very far with the Netscape approach that's valid to this day. Still, we'll have a closer look at add event listener and how that works in the next video. Let's have a look at the most common and recommended way of adding something called an event listener to a DOM element. An event listener is basically a mechanism that waits, that listens for an event to occur. Once it does, there's some code that handles the event. You have already seen how that method is called. We start by selecting a DOM element, for instance, by using document get element by ID, but of course any of the other DOM selection methods will work equally well. And then we call add event listener. At minimum, that method expects two arguments. The first one is the name of the event. So click is a common one when a mouse click or a tap on, say, a button, a link, or any other DOM element occurs. And the second argument is the event handling code, the code that needs to be run once that event occurs. So here's a very simple example. We have a function. That function can receive information about that event. So I'm storing it in a variable e, which I can then use in the function body. Well, and then we will handle the event. Let's have a look. Let's migrate our existing code to add event listener. So let's use add event listener here. As the name already suggests, you add one more event listener, so you can have several, which is a main advantage over just using on, click on something. And as you've just seen, the first argument is the event, and the second one is the handler function, which we already have here, add to cart. And once again, you could have an anonymous function here, which you might be able to add in. So both approaches work, but I'd like to show this one. So this is the code. Minor refactoring still will work sufficiently well. However, one thing we can do when adding event listeners like this, we can also remove them later. If you have several event listeners, we can remove individual ones. However, that does not work easily with anonymous functions. But if we have a named function like here, we could do it. I show you a very simple implementation that only makes sense if there's only one place where you're using this function. For the sake of simplicity, I think this approach is viable here. It would not be viable if you were using the add to cart function on several places on the page, which you would usually do. So we can also do a remove event listener, and this method also expects the name of the event and then the listener. Let's give this a try. Here we go. So I hit that button once, and we now have one ticket in our shopping cart, and I hit it again and nothing happens. Why? Because we removed the event listener. There is an extra argument to the add event listener method, and historically there only was an option to provide a Boolean value. Modern browsers also allow a hash table with some settings, and the most useful one, at least in my opinion, is once, because once basically says this event listener works once, and once the event occurs, so for instance once a user clicks on a DOM element, the code runs, and then the event listener is removed again. So let's quickly refactor this. I think this approach is much better. So we set once to true, and then can remove the remove event listener call, which also makes the add to cart method or add to cart function a little bit more independent on the add event listener call. You may remember the argument the event handling function automatically receives. It contains information about the event. There are different options and they differ a little bit between browsers, but here are the most common ones. First of all, the type of event. So for instance, if it's the click event, type is set to click, which is pretty important, especially if you have an event handler that listens to different events, or event handling code that should run for different events, for instance, a click or a double click. And of course, you might also be interested in the element where that event was fired or triggered. Just imagine you have 5 buttons. You have the same event handler for all of them. But of course, you have to find out which of these 5 buttons has been clicked. And that's what you can find by using the target property of that event argument parameter. That gives you the DOM element, and then you can query it and, for instance, have a look at some attributes of it or its tag name. Depending on the event, there are also event-specific properties. For instance, if you have keyboard events, you might be interested in which key was pressed. If you have a mouse event, you might be interested in the coordinates of, say, the click. So where was the mouse pointer, or where exactly did the user tap on the screen? We'll cover mouse and keyboard events later in this course, so you'll get much more details about that. Here on the shopping cart page, we already have the remove from cart function from earlier, which expects the index of the essentially table row to remove when removing an item from the cart. And the table rows in our example go from 0 through 4. So we could add an event listener to the remove from cart button in the first row, and then call remove from cart of 0, and for the next row, remove from cart of 1, etc., etc. But I'd like to solve this with just one event handler. In order to do that, there are different strategies and approaches, and the one I'm showing you looks a bit complicated at first, but it also gives me the opportunity to point out some other things to watch out for when doing event handling with the DOM. I've already prepared the HTML a little bit for our endeavors. So for each table row, I have added an attribute called data-idx, and I've written the table row index in it. So values from 0 through 4. Then if we look at the HTML hierarchy, if we are at the bottom with the remove from cart icon and go up once, we reach the table cell, and if we go up once more, we reach the table row where we can access the data-idx property. However, it could be that we do not really hit the button, we hit the text on the button, the icon, the remove from cart icon to be exact. In that case, we have to go up 3 times. Once to reach the button, once more to reach the table cell, and a third time to reach the table row. That's pretty important, and why that is the case and why we could hit both of those HTML elements is something that we'll cover in a bit. But this is all we need to know. So how about this implementation? I start by accessing all of the buttons on my page. Now, I happen to know that document get elements by tag name works this time because the only buttons on the page are those remove from the cart buttons. If you have more buttons, you probably should use document.querySelectorAll and then have a more specific selector. But here, all buttons is exactly what I want, and then I would like to iterate over them like this for each. However, there's a catch. I can't for each over the data returned by get elements by tag name, but using the spread operator, I can do that. So I iterate over all of the buttons, and for each button, I just do a button.addEventListener. The event name is click. I would like to listen for the click event, and the event handling code is in the function remove item from cart, which I'm about to write right now. So function remove item from cart. And since this is an event handling function, it automatically receives event arguments, and I'll use the local variable e for that. And then I try to access the table row. So I start by doing something like this, e.target, because target gives us the element where the event was triggered. So if I clicked on the button, that's the button. And in case it's the button, .parent node is the table cell, and .parent node again is the table row. If I clicked on the icon, however, that's not the table row, it's the table cell. So I have to go up once more. So I take a look at the tag name property. The tag name property of a DOM element is the HTML tag name in all uppercase. So if that's not tr, if I'm not in a table row, then I just say row equals row.parent node, going up once again. That's it. And now I can read out the data-idx attribute. So idx equals row get attribute and then data-idx. And I can call remove from card idx. That works relatively well. Of course, I could cast the attributes to an integer first, but still, I have to change the remove from card function. Why? Because look at the implementation. We iterate over all table rows and then basically count which one we want. That works well until we have removed a row, because that changes the numbering. And therefore, we need a different strategy. So how about this? We use query selector instead of query selector all, because we're just reading out one item. And in order to do that, I am changing the selector a little bit. So I'm not interested in just all of the table rows, but just in those table rows, or in that table row to be exact, where data-idx has a value of, well, and that's what's in the idx variable. And then, if that item exists, then I remove it. And that's the whole implementation that we need for that removal functionality. Back in the browser. So how about remove this one first, and it's gone, and now this one, and it's gone as well. So the implementation might not be perfect, but it works really well and also shows you a couple of concepts with regards to DOM event handling. HTML has a hierarchy, and that's super important when talking about event handling, because by default, what the browser does for events is something called event bubbling. Let me explain that with the structure we have already seen a few times in this course. Let's just imagine that someone clicks on the link. So there will be a click event here on that A element. But if you click on a link that's part of a paragraph, essentially you also click on the paragraph. And that's why the event is bubbling up. So the A element receives the event, and if we have an event listener there, that event listener is triggered. But afterwards, the event bubbles up. It goes up the tree if the root is at the top. So also the P element here receives the click event. And that goes on and on and on. So in our example, we also click on the body element. So if we had a click event handler there, that event handler then takes care of the click event, and then we would even go up to the root of the document. That can be pretty useful if you have a complex structure in your HTML and you don't really care where within that structure the user is clicking, but you need a central place for handling those clicks. Thanks to event bubbling, we can simplify our implementation somewhat. Instead of assigning multiple event listeners, one per table row, we could just assign one to somewhere else higher up in the hierarchy, for instance, to the table or even to the container that includes the table. The container already has an ID, card table, so why not use that? So what we are doing is we are calling get element by ID of card table. It's the div container. And then we add an event listener. That event listener listens for the click event and then calls remove item from cart. Please note that this only makes sense if this is the only place, or the buttons, the remove from cart buttons are the only place where you are intending to work with click events. Otherwise, the implementation might get a little bit more messy. Now, in the remove item from cart function, basically all we need to do is once again read out the data-idx attribute. Remember, wherever we click in our table now, the event is either at the span element with the icon or at the button, and then bubbles up. Table cell, table row, table, and then at one point the container. So once again, we have to have a look at e.target, and I'm implementing it a little bit differently this time. So I'm storing the DOM element where the click event originated in EL, and then I have a close look at it to find out which row we need to remove. So I start by setting the row to null, and then I have a specific look at the element. So if the element is the button, so if the tag name property is uppercase button, then the row is EL, and then dot parent node twice up. Otherwise, if the tag name is span, and I mean, there might be so many spans, so let's be a little bit more specific. We know that the span element contains the remove from card icon. So let's look for that icon. We assign that icon by applying a CSS class. So we can have a look at the class list and then see whether it contains a certain entry. And the one here is this one, filled remove from card icon. Basically, that's all there is. And if we have a span like this, then row equals, and then L, and then 3 times up. So parent node dot parent node. All right. And if row is not null, then we can basically proceed as before. So we read out the data-idx attribute, and then we call remove from card. Here we go. We remove this one, we remove that one. Works exactly as intended. There is one more thing. Maybe if we handle the event, we don't want it to bubble even further up, because there might be side effects. If that is the case in your scenario, here's what you can do. So if we remove an item from the card, we would like to stop the event from bubbling up. And this is how it works. I just go to the event arguments and then call stop propagation. Stop propagation makes sure that the event doesn't bubble up further in the DOM hierarchy. However, if there are event listeners listening to the same event on the same level in the hierarchy, remember, add event listener means we can have multiple event listeners, even for the same event, then those other event handling functions will still be run. If you even would like to avoid this, you can also do stop immediate propagation, but you never know which of those event listeners is run first, so usually stop propagation is what I recommend. For the sake of completeness, I want to mention that there is also an event, let's say, hierarchical movement mechanism that goes into the opposite direction when compared to event bubbling. It's called event capturing. So once again, we click on the link, but the event needs to find its way through the structure. So it starts at the top and goes to the body element, down to the paragraph, and finally down to the A element where the user was clicking. There's also a way to handle those events during that capturing phase. However, most of the time event bubbling is what you would like to use, because you click on something and then the outer container might be relevant, usually not the other way around. And that's why by default the add event listener method uses event bubbling and not event capturing. I'd like to show you a pretty important feature when doing event handling with JavaScript. I would like to prevent certain default behaviors of the browser. Let me explain what I mean with that. Typical examples for such default behaviors are buttons, or to be precise, submit buttons within an HTML form. The default behavior of such a button is that the form is submitted. Or if we have links, for instance, that link to the shopping cart page here, if we click somewhere on or inside that link, the default behavior is that that link is loaded, no matter whether we wire up some event handlers or not. Let me demonstrate that. For instance, we could say we do not allow going to the shopping cart page if there are no items within the shopping cart. In order to do that, let me write a helper function first. So how about get cart item count? And I just copy that in here and then just do a return. And then let count equals get cart item count, because I need that now as well. That's the idea. So I would like to add an event listener to our link to the cart page. How could we do this? For instance, by calling document query selector. And then my selector could be something like this. All A elements where the href attribute is set to ./cart HTML. That's what we have in the HTML markup. And once we have that element, we can do add event listener. The event name once again is click, and I'll use an anonymous inline handler function here. And I first get the count, so let count equals get cart item count. And then if the count is 0, I'm opening up a modal warning box and say, no, the cart is empty. All right, so far so good. Let's try this out in the browser. Shopping cart is empty. I click here on that icon, for instance, because that's within the cart link. And yes, I get the message, the cart is empty. But what happens if I close that message with OK here? I was redirected to the cart.html page. Why? Because a link has a default behavior. But in that specific case, maybe I just don't want that default behavior. What can we do about that? Well, in that specific case, if there are no items in the shopping cart, I would like to prevent the default behavior of that link. And that's exactly what I'm writing here in JavaScript now. I'm using the event arguments and then call prevent default. The name of the method says it all. Prevent the default behavior. Let's go back to the main page. Still, shopping cart is empty. I click on that icon. Yes, cart is empty. I hit OK and nothing happens. So I'm not redirected back to the shopping cart because I have prevented the default behavior of the hyperlink. And now it's time to keep a promise that I've made a while ago. We talked about waiting until the DOM is ready. So far, our code has been put at the very bottom of the page, because then we know the page has been rendered, the DOM should be ready, so we can do that. However, now that we know how event handling works, we have better approaches to use, and I will show you how. Let's take the whole script block here, cut it, and then paste it, how about here, in the head block. Then I reload the page in the browser, but first I open up the console. So reload, and doesn't work. Well, there is some dummy data here, but all of the event handling code is not in effect, because we were applying it before the DOM has been fully rendered. For instance, the footer does not show the current year. One event that comes in handy here is the load event. We could do something like this. On load equals, and then we run some code. But yeah, we didn't want to use HTML attributes for that, did we? So instead, we can set up an event listener. So how about this? We try, and now it's important, not document, but window, and then add event listener, because load is a window event, not a document event, and that will become important in a minute. So the event name is load, And the code we would like to run is, well, basically this whole code here. So let's close that. And we are good. Now the JavaScript code only runs once, well, the page has been loaded, whatever that means. In order to be able to show you that, I go to the Network tab and add some throttling. So how about fast 3G? So it takes a while until everything has been loaded. And now let's give it a try. So I reload the page and you see at first the font is missing, now the font is there, but the copyright year still not there. And slowly the images are loaded. It takes a while. And once the images are fully there and all of the other resources on that page, CSS, etc., then the code runs. So the load event is fired once the full page is there. In some cases, that's what we want. However, in our case, we are not interested in all of the images being there. We would like that the functionality, adding elements to the cart, etc., works as soon as possible, and also that the copyright year appears as quickly as possible. And for that the DOM is there, independent of images, style sheets, and other external resources. For that, we have a specific event, and that's called DOM content loaded. We can use document add event listener for that. And now back in the browser, we can witness the following thing. Throttling is still activated. I reload. And you see that immediately the copyright year is there, even though the images are still being loaded. So DOM content loaded is probably the event you'd like to use for all of your DOM setup JavaScript code. We've now taken a look at general event handling for JavaScript, but for specific events, especially when talking about mouse events and keyboard events, there are additional things to consider. So that's why we will cover them next.